Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
I
Got Board Game. I am Ben.
John.
And welcome to our detailed review of... Oh, I put too many things on it.
Marvel Champions.
Marvel Champions. There you go. So yeah, if you guys are curious about how the game generally plays, you can check out our summary review video where I provide a general overview with some of the card types and the phases of each round. But in our detailed review right now, we are going to be sharing our pros and cons on the different parts of the game, along with mentioning expansions and stuff like that. And so for now, just a quick recap, Marvel Champions is a cooperative LCG published by Fantasy Flight Games. And so an LCG, or a living card game, is a type or model of game trademarked by Fantasy Flight Games, in which they describe it as a variant on the collectible card game. And so essentially it has the kind of depth and even deck building or pre-construction kind of aspect from those games, but in its own system. Like Marvel Champions will play its own way, and other LCGs such as the Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Call of Cthulhu, all of those are LCG games by Fantasy Flight. They all have their own gameplay system, but it has that depth of being able to pre-construct your deck the way you want before you play. But it's different from collectible or trading card games in that a living card game doesn't have randomized booster packs. So there isn't any of that collectability that you have to deal with, or randomized cards when you're buying new stuff. What happens with a living card game is they'll release new, basically mini expansions every few months. And then when you buy that, or when anyone buys it, it comes with set cards. So everyone's going to get the same cards when you buy one pack of it. You generally just need to buy that one pack. Then you're up to date. You just add that to your game. You have the same cards that everyone else got. And so that's basically how a living card game works. But then aside from that, we'll get into the details of how Marvel Champions, the different aspects or parts of it that basically are the hero cards, or the hero packs, the scenario packs, which are the villains that get released with the game. We're going to talk about those parts and share our pros and cons as they come to mind. We're not going to do our traditional format of pros and then cons, because that might seem a little too disjointed or hard to keep track of. So we'll just talk about these main parts and just the pros and cons together in each one. And so starting with the hero packs, or the heroes, or for example, this is what a hero pack looks like, right? If you just buy this Venom one, you'll get this hero, and he comes with a deck that's already ready to play with. Or you can kind of use those cards in other decks too. But yeah, so hero packs and heroes, we'll talk about what we think of that part of the game first. So starting with John on that.
Yeah, so with these kinds of games, I think one of the most important things, and kind of what makes you want to keep playing this game over and over, is in this hero pack system, in the fact that you have a large and growing cast of heroes that they're adding into this game. So I believe when the original game first came out, it came out with what, 5 or 6 heroes?
Five heroes. Spider-Man, Black Panther. Oh yeah, on the picture in your back, Spider-Man, Black Panther, Iron Man, Captain Marvel, and She-Hulk.
Yes. So those are the 5 that you started with. It's the whole reason why you play this game is to play all of these different characters, to be all of these different heroes from the Marvel system and in the Marvel world and universe, and kind of pit yourself against a bunch of these kinds of villains. So I'll say one of the really great things about what Marvel Champions has done is, in these both pre-constructed decks and the hero decks that you can buy, and you playing the characters, the whole character of these heroes in this game. And one of the specific mechanics that I do want to point out, what I think is really clever and really great about the hero system is that you're not just a hero that just is just straight up fighting the villains. You actually have two sides and two different kind of versions of yourself, which is like in the comic books or like in the Marvel universe, which is you have your hero side. So your typical Spider-Man, Captain America, Black Panther, Iron Man, or She-Hulk. Well, some people don't know who She-Hulk is yet, but She-Hulk version, which is like the hero. That's the one that goes in the fights and all of that, where you're going toe to toe with your villain, trying to beat them up and defeat their schemes. But in this game, you also have your alter ego side. So Peter Parker versus Spider-Man, or T'Challa for Black Panther, Tony Stark as the alter ego side for Iron Man, where the game puts you in situations in which you have to balance out when you're going to be in your hero mode and when you're going to be in your normal mode or your alter ego mode, because the side that you're on will affect how the game is going to work. So for example, switching to your alter ego side for most characters typically allows you to have more cards in your hand, which is very important because you want to be playing lots of cards. And so that's why your alter ego side is kind of your like preparation for when you're getting ready to fight against the villains, versus when you're in your hero side, you're going toe to toe, you're trying to beat them up, you're trying to get through the schemes, but you tend to have less cards for most of the heroes at that point, where you have less things that you can do directly in your actions or in your turn. So it becomes this balance of how much time should I spend in my alter ego side recovering, healing health, or playing cards getting ready, versus needing to actually fight the villain. And I think it's a super clever way of bringing in both sides of that, where in most superhero games or hero type games, especially in worlds and lore that have, your normal version of yourself and then the heroic version, it's usually not as well captured like it is in this game, where you're either always just in that hero mode, so you never really see the alter ego side, or if they even implement it, it's usually not that great. Or at least as far as I've recalled, I have not thought of a system that does it as well as Marvel Champions.
Yeah, no, I do agree. Like in a lot of games where you are playing a powered up person, like even like, I don't know, it's kind of showing here like the Power Rangers game that I do enjoy, right? Like those kind of heroic games, you are basically always in hero mode, right? You just like going at it in your suit. Let's like bash on the bad guy. But then, yeah, one of the key mechanics in this game is that those identity cards. And that's actually one of the most exciting things to learn about with a new hero. You're getting to see like, okay, yeah, I know the comics. I know like Peter Parker is Spider-Man. So yeah, they're going to design the card that way. But what are the actual stats and abilities that are different on both sides of the card? How are they going to make that feel like Peter Parker versus Spider-Man? And then the mechanic being that during the hero phase, or when all the players are playing their turns, you only get to switch once, right? You can't just keep switching. But then exactly what you said, what side you're on really determines how you're going to be playing that round, and even how the villain will react against you when their turn comes, when their cards are drawn. Because on the alter ego side, you could have an ability that helps you set up in some way, like you mentioned, but you have different abilities on both sides, right? The hero will have some ability, the alter ego will have a different ability. And then also your own deck of cards, a lot of the hero cards, right? The cards that are specific and basically you're required to have those in your deck if you're playing as that hero. Different cards will have requirements, like this card can only be played when you're in alter ego mode, right? Or this card can only be played when you're in hero mode, which makes sense thematically, like one of Spider-Man's strongest cards, I think, is like swinging web kick. Yeah. But it's like, you're not going to have Peter Parker do a swinging web kick, or there's going to be time. I think he has another card that's maybe like an ally, that's Aunt May.
Yeah.
And I think, if I remember correctly, I might be wrong, but maybe Aunt May's ability to help maybe recover some of your hit points can only be activated when you're in alter ego, because I mean, in the comics, Aunt May is known for not knowing Peter Parker being Spider-Man. So it's not like she's going to be giving Spider-Man cookies or whatever, like it's going to be when you're Peter Parker. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that decision gets real tough, right? So I think that thematic feel is amazingly captured, as you said. But then I also do really like how not only is there that identity card, but then also adding in the aspect that you want to play as, right? Because that's the little part where if you enjoy like building your decks for a game before you play, that's where you can sink a lot of time kind of trying to choose what cards you want in your deck, because it's not as straightforward as you choose Spider-Man. Spider-Man just has his full deck of Spider-Man cards, right? You get to kind of choose before you start the kind of Spider-Man you want to play. Do you want to play the aggressive Spider-Man that's mainly about attacking the villain, and that's obviously how you win the game, beating the villain? Or do you want to play a more protection or defensive Spider-Man that has other cards that help him protect like his hit points and even the other players' hit points? And so I think that aspect system sounded a little confusing at first if you don't play a lot of these kinds of games, or even video games with these archetypes, right? These kind of different roles like healer and tank and those kind of terms for those of you who understand. But they do incorporate that in this game, right? And so you can kind of play your heroes in a slightly different way each game because of this combining aspects.
Yeah. And I think the aspects part, that's one of the things that I haven't done too much in my own personal gameplays of the game. I've usually stuck with the standard decks, or like the original pre-constructed decks that have come out of each of these hero packs. But I do know that there are definitely ways in which you can tailor it. And I think that's also one of the cool parts about the cooperative aspect of the game too, where there's different heroes, and as we were saying with Spider-Man, right, he has a lot of versatility. So maybe you're teaming up with let's say like Black Panther, who is known for kind of being a pretty aggressive hero and character already in terms of his fighting prowess and fighting ability. So to have two heroes that are just all about just trying to go at it and attack might not be the best thing. So if you, especially when you start playing and you're more familiar with the game and you're playing with other people who are familiar with the game too, that level of customization then allows you to be like, okay, I can tailor my deck and I can tailor my character to then kind of fit that niche or fit that objective to ensure that, we don't get wiped out in like the first few minutes of the battle or the first few minutes of the game, because I balance myself to help protect your character. So you can just focus on dealing and dishing out all the damage as possible. I'll make sure that I'll keep track of the villain, make sure he doesn't have his little sidekick running around trying to like do his dastardly schemes on the side, or or like defending him, where it's like, if you think about the movies or you think about the comics, like when you have these hero team ups with each other, that's what happens sometimes. Like Spider-Man's throwing out web and he's like cocooning people, or like pulling someone out of the way of danger and stuff like that. I think that definitely helps capture that process and what's going on. I think another thing that's really cool about the game too is the variability of all the characters and how unique they feel from each other. So as we were mentioning before, they really put a lot of effort and thought into not just the flipping of the characters between their alter ego and their hero side, but even the skills and abilities that all of these characters have. They're very, very unique from one another. I would say later expansion characters especially tend to be even more unique from each other. Maybe the early heroes tended to be a little bit more balanced or a little bit more along the lines of each other in standard actions of protection, of attacking, defending, and things like that. But later on in the game, you get a lot of characters like Doctor Strange, who I've gotten the pleasure of playing, or as Ben was sharing, he has the Venom villain pack, or the Venom pack to play as, but I've actually played on the tabletop simulator, and you get a lot of unique mechanics where with Venom, his whole thing is, it's not the traditional Venom who just, is the symbiote suit and is basically kind of like a similar clone of Spider-Man, just like a slightly nastier and more intensive version than Spider-Man. This Venom is actually one that utilizes a lot of equipment. So he uses a lot of guns in his fighting, but it's also kind of like really powerful weaponry that he utilizes. But unlike Iron Man, it's not equipment that he keeps forever. It's kind of like one-time use or a couple-time use weapons. that he can have a lot of them out, but it's kind of like having an arsenal of a bunch of guns that he's kind of like shooting a bunch, and then he just drops the guns, and then he moves on to his next gun, and then keeps shooting and fighting, right? So if you kind of think of like, if you ever watch that scene in The Matrix, the elevator scene, right before he goes into the elevator when Neo has a bazillion guns and everything, it's kind of like that scene with Venom, though. So like, think of Venom swinging around with his guns, his sonic blasters, and all that. That's kind of his play style, right? And then you get Doctor Strange, who actually he has his own pre-constructed deck of spell cards that are unique to his character alone. And as you play as Doctor Strange, you basically have to be preparing spells that will be incanted over time. So it kind of adds on to his deck of cards that he's allowed to play out, but you have to set it up in a way where you can actually cast the spells from his deck, which are usually very powerful abilities, but it comes at a cost usually, or it's not something you can just do right away anytime. They take time to prepare, they take time to set up, and you have to put it in the right timing, in the right place, because sometimes the spell, you might really want to use it, but it's not good for what you're dealing with right now. So again, with what we were talking about with the timing, it kind of feels very much like Doctor Strange in that way of he's really powerful, but he has to use his skills and abilities at the right time in the right place. Otherwise, the villain will catch on and they'll like destroy him or something like that.
Yeah, sorry if all of you see me kind of shuffling on the side. I'm trying to look for some of these cards that John's mentioning so you guys can see. Mm-hmm. It's a little hassle to pull out Doctor Strange right now without everything organized. But yes, like exactly what you're saying, like the way the heroes feel different, I think is really a hallmark of the game. I did pull out like a couple, like Hawkeye.
Yeah.
Who, alter ego, as we know, Clint Barton, maybe you now know from the Hawkeye series. Like, even Hawkeye is someone in this game having his bow as a main weapon that he uses. And then a lot of his own hero cards are different types of arrows, right? Like the trick arrows people like seeing, right? And so they'll do different things if you can kind of pull them out, and you can even save them, I think, in his quiver equipment, right? So very kind of thematic with him, where then you also have characters like Quicksilver, who then you do get a sense with his cards and his abilities that he attacks very quickly, right? Like multiple times, even though it's not strong hits, you can get off a lot of hits. And the way they kind of do that is because in this game, following trading card games like Magic, where a lot of the abilities you have to tap the card or exhaust it or basically rotate it sideways to indicate that you're doing the ability, and that kind of is using up that card. A lot of abilities require you to do that. Even your basic attack in this game, right? Like with like an attack stat, if you're gonna do 2 damage, you'll have to tap Hawkeye to attack something with that 2 damage. But then for Quicksilver, a lot of his cards allow him to untap or unexhaust or rotate back so he can attack again or do something else again. So that really is thematic too. And I think all of that, all this stuff about the heroes feeling different works really well because the overall system works really well, where I think maybe 2 of the things that I also really like is one, that there is a scheme that the villain always has, right? And in its own, that's already thematic, right? Like versus a game that's just like, choose a villain, we're gonna just beat up on you as quickly as we can, right? Any good villain we know is plotting something, has its own plan that they're trying to pull off. And even then, like, and we'll get into the villains more in detail after this, but even then, you have villains that might lean more towards trying to hurt you, do damage to the heroes, or ones who are better at scheming or advancing their schemes, adding threat to it. And the threat, as I mentioned in our summary review video, it's kind of like the hit points of a scheme, because there is always the main scheme that a villain's trying to do, that if they put too much threat on it, it advances to the next level, and eventually it can advance to a point where you guys just lose the game instantly. But then there's also side schemes that can come out of the villain deck that also can advance or have to be dealt with. And I think that's such a brilliant system, not because of just the thematic part, but because then it gives way to another stat line on heroes called thwart. And so in that case, and I think John was kind of hinting at this too, right? That in the planning of the game, you have to deal with these two different paths, if you will. One path is the way you know you'll win the game by actually attacking and damaging the villain, but then you have to thwart to keep schemes from going out of like
control.
Yeah, go crazy on you, right? Because once they advance, they can continue doing their bad effect, or they can even just advance and do a bad effect once that's pretty bad against all of you. And so you have to manage both parts. Like, when should we be attacking because that's the way to win, but when should we be dealing with the main scheme or side scheme so we don't face other consequences? And I think that's really smart and adds to what you have to plan for. And that's then also what the heroes and their abilities fit into, right? Again, like when you're working together, maybe I should be the one to attack, and then you should be the one to deal with the schemes, so that we're dealing with both fronts at the same time, right? Or, just different ways we need to coordinate that so things don't go real bad for us real quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like, I think that's also one of the unique things about the game, where it's like, yes, the win condition, as you were just mentioning, there's only one win condition, which is to defeat the villain, beat up the villain until they have no more HP, right? So you have to knock them out. But it's this concept of like, villains aren't so one note that they only have one thing that they're doing, right? And it's like, even if you think about the scenarios and situations of a lot of these villains that are shown in, if we're thinking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for example, in the first Avengers movie, Loki was attacking with all the people, right? And so if you're thinking about that, it's like, okay, there's Loki as the villain himself that they have to beat, but then there's also the entire army of the Chitauri that are attacking. So you have to deal with that threat, right? That what's going on, right? There's this army that's invaded. And then you also then have to deal with another scheme that comes up out of nowhere, which is a nuke that the US or the government launches because they're trying to eradicate it. So it's not even like the villain's scheme, it's just something else that gets thrown in, but it has to be dealt with, because if you don't take care of it, bad stuff happens. So obviously in this game, they don't go that level of detail, but like that's the feeling you get as new side schemes are showing up, or new encounters, which we'll be getting into shortly, come up. And as the heroes, you have to decide, I've been fighting the villain, but maybe I need to go deal with that scheme instead, right? And it's like, can I really afford to deal with the scheme? Because if I keep dealing with the scheme, the villain's gonna get away, which sometimes might happen, right? Where they start recovering themselves, or they come back and they hit you harder because you're so busy dealing with something else. And that's where you really get that feeling of, what is the right action? What is the right call that I need to make? Which is kind of getting that feeling of, if I were a superhero and I needed to make that choice, I'm now in that situation in which I have to make that choice. So I think that's really, really well done. And it means that it's not just a simple matter of, I've just got to dish out the highest, numerical damage values. It's I have to consider spreading my quote damage, because it's different types. It's a different stat. It's not just like, I beef up my strength and now I can, blow up the scheme and blow up the villain, right? It's like, no, you have to do things in different ways with your heroes. And I know there's some heroes like the Hulk who can't even thwart because
because Hulk only smash, not really up here to do the thwarting.
That's all right.
Which makes sense. And something I do want to mention is actually, I think a game that John might mention later and compare to is a game we've mentioned a few times on this channel, Sentinels of the Multiverse. So that might be coming up from John soon. I want to mention it here because of what you actually just said about that it's not as straightforward of just dealing out the most damage, because I think when we played Sentinels years ago, but kind of very into it at that time, that could be kind of how that kind of game felt, right? That superhero game where it's finding ways to just do the biggest hits at a time, right? Because it didn't have this other system of like a scheme and thwarting, right? It was just attacking and surviving, getting enough cards to do that too, And so I do like this added layer, which is a really big layer to add onto this kind of superhero co-op formula. But what I also do love about this system that they have for this game also is is that to play your cards, right? We mentioned the different cards you can play to do certain attacks and such. And in our other video, I mentioned like the cards in your deck, right? Like this Hawkeye deck could also include like allies, equipment, and stuff like that. But all those cards, the way to pay for it is to discard cards from your hand. And because each card, and it's kind of a cool way to do like a multi-use for almost all the cards. It's like you can see, for example, this cable arrow, this trick arrow from Hawkeye, all the cards have a cost in the corner, and it's very simple, not like in certain games like Magic the Gathering, where it's like you need specific types of mana, right? It's all just a number. And then so it generally means any kind of resource, you just need one to pay for this card. But then on the bottom corner, a card will show you what kind of resource it generates when you discard it. And so in this case, it is a physical resource, this fist or red icon. And so what that means is if I discard this card, I get one fist resource, which again could pay for anything that costs one, right? But the fact that it's a specific resource can also combo with whatever card you're playing, because some cards might be like, it costs two, but if you paid that two with at least one physical resource, you get a bonus. And so that goes into your planning of what kind of cards you want to discard to pay for things. But I think even just that system itself is what I love, that you have to pay with cards from your hand to play cards from your hand. And that gets into the tough choices, because you have your deck, which probably has all the cards you want to be able to use, but you absolutely have to sacrifice cards to play other cards. And I think it translates really well in this system, because in other like kind of actual board games where you like might have to spend victory points to get another action or an ability on your turn, like I do like that system too, but I think in those it kind of becomes more calculating, right? It's like, can I sacrifice 2 victory points right now? Maybe, because it'll get me 4 victory points, so it's a net gain. But in this game, since it's a resource system and it's not your actual victory points, it's harder to run that calculation, right? It's like I'm sacrificing this card to play this other card, which can let me do damage, but does that much damage equate this resource or this card's ability later? You know, it's hard to do that kind of translating of what those effects mean in the game. And I think that's what makes it such a good puzzle. It's not so straightforward as, is this going to pay off?
And I think that's I think that's the really clever way that they do this too. So in comparison to a game like Sentinels of the Multiverse, I think one of the difficulties of that game is the feeling that sometimes you get stuck with a certain amount of cards or a certain draw. And one of the, is not a specific review of that game, but one of the things that we've had issues with Sentinels is sometimes you just draw badly or draw poorly in the game, and you feel like you don't really get to do a lot because you just didn't draw the right cards. Typically in this game, because you have these pre-constructed decks and you kind of put this together, and it's also nice in the way that it's not like Magic the Gathering or other games that have resources that you have to kind of tap into every time, or you have to create a resource generator in some way. You always have resources in your hand. You're always guaranteed the capacity or the ability to play, assuming that the villain doesn't do anything to stun you or cause any problems, right? In that way, like you always can do something in your turn. And even if it's as simple as matter as your character itself, I think that's the really great thing about this game too, is that you as a player have agency all of the time when you're playing in your turn. Whether it means you have to do a huge sacrifice of cards in your hand, as you were saying, that's where that juggle comes in. And that's where the kind of the meat of the game for like the gamer feeling comes in, of what sacrifices are worth doing in the game, which I think this game has done a really good job in helping create a way to balance that. Where it's like, for example, as you were saying, they could have made it where buying certain cards required certain resources. that would have stagnated the abilities of the characters a lot if they had decided to go that direction. And you may have ran into those circumstances of like, oh, I'm holding onto this card because I really want to play it, but I just never can because I'm just drawing badly, right? This game, you always will be able to play your card if you kind of really want to play that card. It just, for example, maybe you won't get the bonus if you don't have the particular thing, but you're still going to be able to play the card, and it'll likely still have a strong effect anyway, because typically more expensive cards usually aren't really good. They usually have some pretty powerful effects, but you do have to kind of juggle that and consider that option. So I think that that part is really clever. I was going to mention that the resources in this game and the way that the kind of the player activity and the player motivation throughout the game stays high the whole way through it. Unless you die, then that's the story. But that also is a question of how much did you actually defend yourself? Should you switch out? Right? That's your own choices that you need to make. Sometimes bad stuff happens though, and you just have no control. The only other thing before we move on to the heroes that I wanted to mention was
well, I actually did.
Oh,
I mean,
you have one more.
Yeah.
Why don't you go first?
Yeah. While you're thinking about that,
What I was gonna say.
what I did want to point out is actually like kind of shifting over to maybe the pros and cons that come to mind for me on the hero cards and the hero packs themselves is I think kind of more of a pro and con, maybe like a neutral point, is the co-op aspect of the game. Playing as a hero, and actually what you just said about like kind of always having agency on your turn, I think is really good, because it makes the game less daunting and a little more welcoming for people to play, not just being a co-op game, but because it's not that kind of competitive back and forth two-player game like a lot of trading card games, right? Where I think it makes it more welcoming, because then it's not like I'm doing something and you're immediately going to do something to mess me up, or the villain's going to immediately do something, but it's really the hero phase and villain phase. So we as heroes get to basically do everything we want on our turn, and we don't have to worry about just things coming in the way of our plans. But then in that way, we can focus on our puzzle, right, of our own hands, resources, what we want to play. But I do say this as a little con, because I think it's still not as co-op as you might feel in some of the co-op games we've talked about already, like Pandemic and such like that, because the ways that you can actually do stuff for each other is kind of limited, right? Like you might have certain equipment that you can save and then wait for when it's the other player's turn to then, okay, I'm going to use this to give you that extra resource you need, right? Like that's kind of the most basic case that would happen. But then the other kind of co-op planning is not so much doing stuff for each other, but more like, okay, I'm going to attack and stun the villain, so then you can do this to them on your turn, right? So, but I think the actual kind of doing stuff for each other is kind of lacking feeling in the co-op feel of that game, of this game. And so in that way, that's why it's kind of a pro and con. Like it's there, and I do think it's welcoming that we can plan together, but it's not so much like I'm just like going out all my stuff for you and that works out great. It's just there's certain actions that I can do for you or say for you this round, right? That can make the difference, obviously, but it's still not like a lot of stuff that you're doing for the other player, I would say. So that's like my pro con so far.
Yeah, and there is some other things that you can do for the other players and allies that actually is kind of important and can come up that pivotally in the game, as you were mentioning, which is sometimes like the capacity or ability to defend another ally in the middle of them being attacked, where they could be down to their final hit points and then they get an encounter that happens to maybe almost kill them off. And if it's an attack, then you can use your hero, you exhaust your own hero, which means you'll be exhausted at the start of your next turn, but you can at least defend them and protect them at that moment in time, or use one of your allies to do that and such. So there is a little bit more, I think, especially when you start playing more like when there are villains that tend to have a lot more like attacks going on, where you get a little bit more of that playability, or certain if you set up your deck that way. But I do agree with you on a base level. direct
Yeah, I mean,
interactions with each other tends
yeah, because I mean, like, I
not
think
as
even that
strong.
kind of stuff, like defending, it's like it just the action itself seems small. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
just I'm deciding to do it. Compared to the actual puzzle that you play dealing with your resources on your turn, right? Like that's more of you playing your own turn, and that's like kind of the chunky part of it. For
Mhm.
then deciding to defend you later, yeah, we can plan for that, but that's kind of I'll do it or not, right? Kind of a
Yeah.
simple thing, I would say. That's kind of what I was getting at.
Fair. Cool.
But then, yeah,
What
did
I was
you?
thinking about actually comes into the villains and scenarios.
Oh,
So
okay,
I'll just
okay.
skip over into that side, but I'll talk about that later.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think the actual cons I had that are small cons, but it is kind of what I remember from my early experiences of the game
Mhm.
that only kind of went away when I had this period of time, like later last year, of playing a lot of this game solo,
Mhm.
which I enjoyed a lot, trying like different combinations of decks, like or constructing different heroes decks differently and
Mhm.
seeing how far they can go against different villains. Uh, but the thing that kind of might come up a lot when you're first playing the game is the way you track some of your actions. The game doesn't actually really have any system for tracking if you did a certain action or not. And I think that's a small ding against the game because you kind of have to play the game enough to be in a habit of remembering what you
Mhm.
did on a turn, like how you planned your turn out.
Yep.
But early on, you might forget, and I think the main thing is like, did I flip my hero this turn? Did I flip from alter ego to hero or the other way, Because that makes a big difference, right? That'll determine how the villain reacts to you, what actions you can still do on your turn,
Mhm.
because you could actually, be in hero side, play a card that requires you to be in hero side, then flip to alter ego and then be like, okay, now I'm going to play my alter ego ability to get a resource back. And then you're like, wait, did I flip already? Because I wanted to do this other thing on hero side that required that resource I just got. Well, you technically can't go back and
Yep.
use that resource now, right? So
Mhm.
without a way to actually track that, like no like token saying like you flipped already, or even cases where like an ability might a lot of abilities actually say like once per turn or once
Mhm.
per phase. There's no way to track that, like I activated this and did a damage. And then later on your turns like, wait, did I activate this due to the damage already, or do
Yeah.
I get to do it again, right? There's no way to mark that unless you really just come up with a way with whatever tokens the game comes with.
Mhm.
uh, but I think that's kind of a ding, just kind of the tracking and management of your gameplay, which mainly happens on the hero side because that's where you're having the choices to do what kind of abilities and such like that.
And that is a good point because there are, as you were mentioning, those are a couple of great examples, but there also is some of the examples of just action abilities that you can just do right in a turn. And sometimes it's not limited once per turn, but
Mhm.
it is like you do it once and then you can only do it once, right?
Mhm.
But then it's like, did you actually do it or did you not? Because sometimes, right, not all actions require your characters to exhaust items.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
another thing too, right? So that's another part of the game, which is a pro. I actually really like that concept because it means, in a lot of games, exhaustion is kind of an annoying mechanic because it limits you, which is good in some ways because it doesn't mean you're broken and you keep doing it all the time. But sometimes it's just like, oh, I wanted to do two or three things, but I can only do one because I exhausted myself. But this game actually allows you to do more than one thing like that, which is nice. But as you were saying, yeah, the tracking of did I do this? Did I not? Then you kind of just have to leave it to chance or leave it to, I hope I remembered this correctly. And, there's a certain element of, in the end, it is a game. So you don't have, really don't kill yourself. And I don't know if this rule book actually explicitly mentions, I forget which game does it, but they like say like, okay, if you really don't remember, it's fine. Just keep playing. Just move ahead.
Okay. No, I
You're
remember.
not
I
like,
remember one game's rule book was
it explicitly says that.
whatever way is worse for you, that's what you go
Oh,
with.
one does
And
it
it's not
that
this
way.
one, but I've come across a game like
And
that.
maybe a different one had did that, but like I know some have said like if you really can't remember, just move forward and then just don't do it again because sometimes it's just too hard to try to remember how far back you went, try and recall everything that happened. So, trying to streamline that the best way. But yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing, and this is maybe more general, not just to heroes, but obviously the game comes with its own rule book, and it's even like a rules reference booklet, which was really nice, kind of a condensed place to look up specific like keywords and terms for different abilities and actions and activations. But I know, and I've used it, that Fantasy Flight has had to release like revised rule book for this game, and that's actually what I had to use when I was playing a lot on my own, of like pulling it up on my computer or my phone instead of the base rule book, because there's a lot of timing clarification they had to do later, which is unfortunate but understandable in a game like an LCG game that models the depth of a trading card game, right? Because especially games like trading card games and people who've played them, like there's very strict timing rules for like when this kind of ability can activate, or does this activate first and then this other kind of ability triggers as a reaction, and so they've had to add a lot of pages to clarify those, which actually probably isn't an issue if you're just playing the base game, because it doesn't involve kind of the character abilities or villain abilities that got introduced later, right? The rules in the base game fit for everything they had in the base game. But yeah, just kind of be aware that if you're adding later stuff, stuff especially that have more specific mechanics, like how John mentioned Doctor Strange and his incantations deck, and that like then you probably have to use the revised rules, which are obviously like just online free on their website and even Board Game Geek, but you'll have to look up like different scenarios of like, oh, what if this specific deck runs out, what do I do? Or yeah, just different timings of when things react to each other or can be done or triggered.
Yeah, and that was something I was going to mention in the later things, but I do agree with you in that sense. There is a lot of scenarios and a lot of situations that does start coming up, especially when you play the game more and more and you get more used to the cards, or as you start kind of timing things and you start reading the cards and you're saying like, okay, well, I know the rules say that this is supposed to happen with this kind of trigger, but based on the certain wording on it. Oh, and that was going to be another thing I was going to mention too, is sometimes the use of language is not always the same on the cards, even though they're supposedly the same effects, or like at least when you read the text. So there is some kind of inconsistency of language clarity within the cards printed and things like that, especially when it comes around to like the force interrupts, or like these skills that kind of trigger on responses to things happening. There tends to be some kind of language inconsistency. So I was going to raise that actually during components section.
Okay, yeah.
But
and we can bring it up then again.
yeah,
also,
that was as a part of the rules clarification aspect. That does come up in the few gameplays that I've had, that came up pretty regularly. We were coming back to the rule book and being like, okay, well, this card, when I played it with this character, says this, but when I play with this character, it doesn't feel like it would make sense, and it feels like this card is useless. So what is that, right? So yeah.
I mean, and I think it's good that Fantasy Flight, being a big publisher, obviously, like they have their whole team that is continually working on Marvel Champions and catching these things. It's just, yeah, you'll have to put in the effort to make sure you look that up too, right? And so with that, I mean, still mostly the stuff we've been mentioning, like that are kind of cons for the latter point so far, I think have been just general things about the game, but still about the hero packs and heroes themselves. It sounds like we really like how they captured that, right?
They did a great job.
Yeah. And I had mentioned to John, like, I'm not caught up on it anymore, but there was still stuff I was like, even watching videos when I was into it, of like previews of new heroes coming, like, oh, that just sounds so creative with that hero, like Venom, for example, and other ones that I don't have now, like Nebula, and like I think more recently like Valkyrie, and there was I know like Visions probably came out recently and stuff like that. So a lot, and we'll get into some of those, the hero packs, expansion content toward the end of this video. But going on to the other part that we want to talk about is the scenario packs is what they are called, but they're basically the villain packs because it's called a scenario pack because that's like the scenario you're actually playing when you choose to play that villain. But that villain then comes with their own deck and their own main scheme card. And then sometimes even other, I think they're called encounter sets, which is another part of the system they have for Marvel Champions, where encounter sets are little thematic story events in the Marvel universe, if you know the comics and stuff, that you will always choose a certain number of encounter sets to shuffle in with a villain deck when you're playing. And then depending on how difficult you want your game to be, you can choose certain harder encounter sets. And they're just harder because of the kinds of events that happen then when they're drawn, or how tough the minions are in those decks, or the side schemes are in those sets. So we'll kind of talk about all of that together right now, the villains along with the encounter sets. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we've kind of alluded to it with the heroes already, in the sense that I think it's a very clever thing that they did by having two different kind of trackers that need to be dealt with, or kind of things that need to happen, where you have the villain themselves who needs to be defeated, and actually like you need to deal damage and defeat them, but also having this concept of the schemes that are coming up in the course of the game, which is a combination of like schemes of the main villain themselves, but also these scenarios or these encounters that occur that sometimes actually need to be dealt with. So like I know in some of the base villains, like the Rhino, for example, one of the encounter packs is like the bomb scare, I believe is what it's called, the encounter. But basically what that is as you're fighting the Rhino, what can show up is these situations in which there's like a terrorist threat of a bomb, threat of a bomb going off. So you must deal with that threat before you can move on. So basically what it says is you can no longer remove threat from anything else or attack the villain until this is taken care of, right? Which means that you must take care of that immediate crisis event, no matter what else is going on in the board. So it's kind of thematic in that sense of when there's for superheroes, like there's a clear threat to, civilians or the people, you have to deal with that immediately, right? You can't go around it. You just got to take care of it. So I think it's a very great way of implementing it versus some of these other cooperative games when you play these superhero style characters like Sentinels of the Multiverse, where they try to do that with their environment deck in their landscape deck, but it doesn't quite play out the same way, because sometimes there's positive ones, sometimes there's negative things, or there's kind of neutral things. So I think this game really captures the essence of the schemes occurring that the villains are like utilizing for their advantage to that effect.
And I do like how in the base set and then kind of releasing individual villains later, that there is a ramp in difficulty, right? That it's not like they're all just hard. They are the villains of this Marvel world, right? Like Rhino is the most basic one, right? That he's like a brute, and his main scheme, at least, is just once it advances to the number, you lost, right? So you just keep that down and focus on beating the crap out of him. but I think it's really good that they set it up that way, because like even for me, like getting new hero packs, right? It's like Rhino is like my testing ground. It's just like, how well can this new hero just deal with Rhino? And like how many times I've had to beat up Rhino, but it's kind of like, then I can go on to the next one and see like, okay, then how far can this hero go with its base deck, right? And I know there's then Claw and Ultron in the base set, which I think then is when you start seeing the ways that it can play differently, right? Where Rhino is a brute, but then Claw can be kind of more disabling, right? And even kind of building up its damage in a different way. Where then Ultron is all about his Ultron bots, right? And the minions that you have to deal with that are really weak, but they can really pile up and hurt you a little bit at a time, or even kind of be bolstered by Ultron if you leave too many out, right? And so I think that's all thematic and cool with those villain characters. But then I think the actual mechanism in the villain phase that I like is the boost icons, where And this kind of actually ties into what we were saying was a cool thing about the hero side, is that depending on if your identity card is on the hero side or the alter ego side, right, that'll determine how the villain activates against you during the villain phase. And the villain activates against everyone. So that's kind of part of the challenge too, right? Like knowing that you're going to have to deal with like a consequence of your decision. And so will each player, depending on being on hero side or alter ego side. Because if you're on hero side, the villain will attack you and try to bring down your life. But if they're on the scheme, if you're on the alter ego side, that's when they scheme, right? They don't, like, in obviously the comic books, it's like the villain maybe doesn't know who this superhero's alter ego is. So instead of attacking this random person, like, I'm just going to keep working on my scheme during this time, right? Which makes sense thematically. But then that's what you have to be aware of then, right? Like, if we're all staying on alter ego side to build up, the scheme's gonna get out of hand pretty quickly. And so we can't maybe do that all at the same time. But then the part that I mentioned that I like about it is this boost icon system, because more than just, actually, let me see if I even, let me show the picture that I had previously shown for the game when teaching it. So you can see, like, here, this is Claw. And so the villains have a scheme value and an attack value similar to the heroes. And so, but it's not as straightforward as, okay, if they're attacking you, Claw's gonna do this 1 damage here, if you can see it. Or if he's scheming, he's gonna advance the main scheme by the 2 that he has up here, right? It's not that straightforward, because aside from that value, you're going to draw a card from their deck. And this is another way that the villains cards are multi-use, because more than just an effect on a card, they all have icons in the bottom right corner. And those icons will tell you how much to add to the villain's scheme or attack when that card is revealed. So there's always that kind of chance too of, like, okay, he's going to hit me for at least 1, but then it depends on what boost icons are on the card that he's drawing when he attacks me. And so it's like, can I handle that? Right. And similar with the scheming. And so, and then Claw in particular, I think his kind of ability of that specific villain is like, he'll draw multiple cards to add boost icons. So it's like, that's very different, right? There's a lot more chance of that, but overall probably more damage, right, in some way. And so I think that boost system is really cool, because you really have to kind of plan against that level of chance, which, and I've always kind of said, I think you always need a good amount of chance in a game, right? Some unpredictability. Like, you do your best to plan for, we don't want the scheme to advance too much, so one of us has to be on hero side, the other has to be alter ego, but you still don't know how much it'll actually advance, you know? So yeah, that boost system. And then also that boost system and not just adding icon or having icons that add to the value. You could have a star, which actually activates an ability on the card versus just doing more damage. And so I think that's really clever. It really adds a lot to what can happen on the villain's turn.
Yeah, and I think overall the boost mechanic is pretty nice. I think it is a little bit confusing though when you do first start playing the game, because there is a differentiation between the villain's action and then the encounter that occurs after the villain. So that is something just to be aware of as you play this game. That has raised some confusion for new players when they first play the game, where they're like, oh my gosh, it's like this villain attacked me and this thing is happening at the same time, where it's like, no. It's just a boost. It's strictly only used for the symbol in the bottom, right? And then it's gone, right? Which includes, which we haven't talked about, but I did want to raise now too, is the Nemesis cards that can potentially show up from the heroes. So kind of moving into that, I think another cool thing about the villain situation and circumstances that in all of the hero packs, which we didn't talk about during the hero section, is that all heroes also come with a Nemesis kind of deck, or like a couple of Nemesis cards. So basically what those cards are is, usually it's 2. So some, maybe the future characters have more unique ones, but typically they'll have 2 nemesis. One is a nemesis that's specifically like a nemesis toward the hero, like some kind of a character that is like in like their like enemy, that they fight against all the time,
Mhm.
or it's something that affects the alter ego of your character, right? So like, for example, I think in Peter Parker's, it's one of his nemesis card is the eviction notice. Basically,
Yeah.
he's going to be kicked out of his home because Peter Parker's a poor photographer who can't get his bills paid because J. Jonah Jameson does not like this guy. All he does is get good pictures of Spider-Man, right? So that's all he gets paid for. But it's an eviction notice where basically it kind of forces, it's an immediate requirement in which the heroes are immediately affected. And usually, typically, it's a very bad effect where it either exhausts your character completely or it shifts you into a new mode. Like you have to shift over into your alter ego mode when maybe you didn't want to be in your alter ego mode or something like that. There's a lot of different variations in these nemesis that can occur, but it adds that kind of spice flavor where it's like, even though you're fighting these specific villains and these specific scenarios, you're these heroes. The nemesis of your heroes are kind of always in play. They'll always affect your life in some way. And so they'll show up in these decks, which I think is also a nice combination of flavor, but also like it's nice to see like, just because I'm fighting this villain doesn't necessarily mean that my nemesis is completely out there, out of the picture, right? They can come in and mess things up.
So. Yeah, that actually is a cool touch. Yeah, we did forget to mention that in the hero pack, but it's also cool because it's like both a hero pack and a villain thing, right? Yeah. Because when you talk about like the heroes you're playing, you do always like organize it with their nemesis. Like you never take it out of that, right? But you take it out during setup because you might encounter it in the villain you're actually playing. So that's it's a part that adds a little kind of like extra steps to the setup, but it's not like confusing. It's just extra steps. But then the flavor that it adds to the game, and then also each nemesis little set always has a side scheme too. Yeah. And so then the nemesis is then kind of like a big bad that you might come across and have their own side scheme to deal with. And so that is a really cool part that you mentioned now. And then the obligation card that you mentioned, every hero has that to deal with, which is pretty devastating. Like, and I think it's really cool to bring it up because you feel it when it happens, right? Like it's a specific encounter card or like event card in the villain deck that causes you to pull out your nemesis and the side scheme. And so when that happens, you're like, oh crap, like we didn't either plan enough to avoid it or we just couldn't avoid it, and now we definitely have like a stumbling block to deal with in this situation. So that is a really cool part of the villain phase. I think the other thing in the villain phase, and that you mentioned that I did want to clarify is, in the steps of the villain phase, you are doing the villain attacking or scheming against each player. And then after all that, you're dealing out encounter cards, which is when you're actually doing what's written on the cards. And I think that is the part that even when you're playing initially, like you mentioned, it could be confusing, but hopefully this clarified it. But aside from maybe being confusing is, it really adds to how difficult the game can feel, right? Because it's not like, hero phase, I do all my attacks, you do all your attacks, villain phase, they just get their one attack, right? It's literally, they attack everyone and they give everyone a bad thing to deal with after that, and it could increase, and that's kind of what I want to mention. Some of the keywords I think were really cool to come across in the game, where I kind of memorized it before this, like crisis, was it like advancements, and where was the other one? Hazard.
Oh yes.
Where these keywords can come up on different encounter cards or cards that the villain ends up playing. And I think they just are kind of thematic, but also really add to the challenge of the game. Like, for example, if a card has the crisis symbol on it, it's usually like a side scheme, and it means you can't thwart or damage the main scheme until you get rid of this side scheme.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like something that's more urgent that you have to deal with. Where then you also have words like hazard, is certain cards, like maybe minions might have it, that then cause the villain to deal out more cards to each player to deal with during the villain phase. And it's like all these kind of key terms are simple to learn, and they're even easy to find a rule reference. But when you're playing with them, it's like, I get what's happening, and it does always suck.
It sucks.
And so but I think it's good. I think it's a good kind of, it is standard for people who play trading card games to know that there's these kind of keywords, but to see it in a co-op system like this and be very fitting and add to the challenge, I think it's a good touch. I think it's a good touch. And I think cons when it comes to the villain packs are sometimes learning how they function. Like, I guess, okay, small pro again. I think a lot of the villains play really differently, especially later ones. Like I remember telling John initially, like the first villain pack that came out after the base set was Green Goblin and Norman Osborn, spoiler. And I think it's really cool because I finally got to play him, but I remember back then just learning that he's a villain that switches between his alter ego also, which is not something you came across in the base set, right? The base set is just straight up fighting villain, straight fighting Rhino or Claw or Ultron straight on. But Norman Osborn being the alter ego of Green Goblin, you had to kind of manipulate his deck while you're playing so that, you know, he might be on Norman Osborn's side and scheming better, but you have to get him to a point so that he switches to Green Goblin. Then you can actually damage him. Before then, after some time, he'll switch back to Norman Osborn. And so, like, you know, something like that is really clever and fitting with that character. But to kind of learn the villains, what like the first time you're playing, it takes some time to kind of get how the cycle actually works for them, what they actually intend to do, or how the deck is supposed to play out. So
and similar in the same way of just trying to recall and remember, as we mentioned with previous about rules or like keeping track of things, like this part also suffers that a little bit of like, did I remember to attack all of the characters, or did I remember to do the particular rules, especially when they add in things that might happen before like the villain's boost phase or after the villain's boost phase or in between the villains, you know, like encounter or something. Sometimes that does come up or that occurs and it does get confusing. Or like if a side scheme appears that adds more hazard, did I need to add more not evictions? Did I need to add more encounters, or did that come before because they were already right? Kind of figuring all of those steps out can get a little bit confusing when you're trying to keep track of all of these, because you're keeping track of not only your own stuff, but you're keeping now track of the villain stuff as well.
Yeah,
so that can be a little bit on the confusing side. But then the other thing to also keep track of is when the villains, or during the encounters, when you flip over minions or these you know, like the minions that that the villain might have, they are specifically in front of particular characters, right? So it's specific to that minion is attacking that hero, that player character only, right? They're not attacking all of them unless they have other rules, but like typically it's like that is for that person. So not to say that other players can't help you fight that, just that it is specifically to them. It's not like a general board area where all the minions are just hanging out. They are usually kind of directly associated in front of a player.
Yeah,
which could be important. That does happen.
Yeah. And I think the term is like when a minion comes in, it is like engaged with the specific player, right? So you kind of need to remember and like put it that way so you're clear that this is my minion that I'm dealing with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
and so I don't know if you had anything else on the villains.
No, I think the villains, I think it's really fun how they do it. I think it is a great way of how they overall presented it. And as we just talked about, the sense of like the villain's agency of attacking or scheming, but then also the encountering over time too, where it's kind of this double use of their deck, which is also very nice again in comparison to other games in the past, like Sentinels or, you know, other kind of cooperative fight against the board like Aeon's End and such, where it's like, you can kind of see how this plays out, and it's not just strictly I'm going to hit you as hard as I can kind of thing. So
then the last part we kind of want to just mention, and I think John specifically has some thoughts on it, are the components and production for this game.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, you had something on it.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, I think as you mentioned before, overall, like the I think the cards are done very, very well across this game. I have some, I feel a little bit maybe neutral about their token utilization, the token use in the game. It feels like it could have been done a little bit better, in my opinion. I feel like some of like the overall, I think they're just kind of cardboard cutouts, and they're very specific of certain uses of like the stun and the, I think, dazed card or confused.
Yeah.
And stuff like they're oh sorry, they're not even cardboard, they're just
These are cards. These statuses are cards. Stun.
Yeah, the statuses. So it's kind of nice that they have them, but ironically, I almost feel like it's very simple for all of the stuff that the game has. And then also the thing of tracking everything when you're putting all these, you have to remember to take these cards, and then you have to put them on particular places of like if your character is stunned or tough or confused. It's just more components, more things to deal with the game that for the most part you're trying to keep away from tokens and away from these things. You're trying to effectively try to keep everything in one single use card. It feels a little bit odd or a little bit strange, and this is actually where I personally preferred the way that Sentinels had done it more with their tokens, that it kind of added up over time, and they were very specific on like numerical values that as you added more of them on, you could kind of tell however much or however many things were being affected by it. Versus in this game, it's like you can only be tough once, but then there's like multiple applications sometimes with new heroes that have come out where it's like you remove a status and then add a new status and things like that, which kind of going back to that general rule of how do you keep track of all of this stuff kind of feels a little bit frustrating. Or even in these, like if they change the tokens from being cards into just an actual token that just said tough on it, like that you could have removed all the text on it, and you just, as you said, right, there's the reference rule book, and you could have easily just said when this token is on this character, or when this character has this is what it means. Reduce the next damage completely, and then that's it, right? You don't need a big card.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Right. So it's just kind of like the cleaning up of some of the pieces or components could have been done a little bit better, in my opinion, on it, where other games have done that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying with the status cards. Like personally, like I do like the cards just because I like sleeving things and it's nice. But no, I get what you're saying. Like visually, I've definitely come across that issue, right? Where it's like in a game that is all cards, you would maybe use tokens to indicate something that sticks out that you need to remember, and not just another card flat thing on top of your flat character that you might kind of lose sight of when you're seeing just a bunch of cards on your table.
Exactly. And it's like even then it's like it could cover up things too, right?
Yeah.
It's such a large card, like if you're placing it on top of things to try to remember it, you have to position it a certain way then to remember that it's on top of it. And then if you don't put it on top of it, and it's like you need to remember it's even there.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where it's like component wise, just having like the cardboard. That's why I thought they were cardboard. That's what I was trying to remember. But if
the other things are cardboard,
right? And so there are some things that are cardboard. Which
like the threat tokens and generic. I mean, I think this was kind of a smart idea.
Yeah, the generic ones I think are good, right?
Yeah, like these literally, these green ones are literally just like generic tokens, and so you use these to count cases where it's like, this card has this many counters on it, meaning this many uses. So just put 3 of these generic tokens on it and remove it as you use it.
So it's like it's a little thing. It's not the biggest complaint or the biggest problem, but it's in a similar vein of just you have that token to just denote that. It could have been done that way, which I think it would have been nicer to have. Plus, typically, you usually aren't dealing out like 15 tough tokens or that many of these things, or unless things get really out of hand. I don't know. Maybe you do. I don't think I've ever encountered needing maybe more than like 3 or 4 at a time. But it's just a small gripe on my part on that. Again, given that it's such a card focused game, that if you're doing things that are outside of the card texts, it's nice to have something that looks a little different than what they are.
Yeah, of
to
course.
then kind of help you remember that. So
Mhm. I think for me, like production wise, the issue I had early on when I was getting a lot of the sets, like the hero packs to add on to the base game, and that I sleeve these games when I can, is that the insert, and I'll show you it here after I've had it organized, originally didn't fit these cards sleeved, at least not sleeved with Fantasy Flight's own sleeves. So this is after those sleeves have been discontinued, I believe. And I think I switched out all the sleeves. Now the cards actually fit, like they're actually flat, but originally I had to put them inside like slanted, which is annoying just because like it's their insert and their sleeves, and yet your sleeves didn't fit in your insert, you know? And then the other issue is that sometimes, like this is just the base set, the base box. I think I got to a point where like, I had a lot of heroes and villains that actually just wasn't enough space in here to fit it all.
Yeah.
And so at least sleeve. Like, I mean, if you didn't sleeve it, I'm pretty sure you could always fit the new sets into like whatever base box or big expansions were out by then. But since I sleeved it, like I did run into issues where like, do I need to get the expansion now just so I have more space to put all the new stuff that I have? That was kind of annoying. So just a bit of a storage issue.
Get ready for that legendary box for Marvel Champions. I said it'll be confusing because then there's legendary, the DC game, right?
But now, yeah, you can see it fits really well, and I'm glad that all my stuff so far does fit, at least for now, until I maybe try to catch up. Then I might run into that issue again. But I think that was all that really came to mind for me production wise. Like I think the artwork actually, let me see if I can pull some of this out. Like some of the artwork on the cards is very nice, right? It's just like it's not anything too crazy, but it is like detailed, like kind of like the comic book art. So I guess I would say I like how it's not like MCU movie clip art, stills from the movies. And actually what I just showed, let me show some other cards. For example, like Black Panther, like I think it looks pretty good. And like the whatchamacallit, the graphic design as well, like it's really, you can understand it pretty well. And then there's like flavor text in italic, so you don't have to read that if you don't want to, right? Vibranium, right? I mean, I think the art's very good comic book art, and like it fits with the borders that they've done. I think the thing I didn't like initially, and maybe I still don't like, is like each hero has like their own icon, which looks particularly 70s comic book style. And it's like that doesn't fit with the modern artwork, I feel.
The nostalgia.
Yeah, and I guess it's functional, right? And it's probably better looking than just like generic black colored symbol for the Black Panther, right? Like actually put like his head, so it's clearer. But yeah, it just kind of was a disconnect in the art that way. And then what I did show though that I thought was cool, I accidentally showed, was that Avenger card I showed, the Avengers Assemble. This is actually a promo card. Which is actually the original artwork on the card, but just bigger. Like they made the text box smaller. And that's generally what they did with their promo cards. For example, like this is the promo Iron Man. So it's more, I think this is how Fantasy Flight usually does their promos. It's called like a full art promo. And so it takes up more fully the space on the card. And so I think it looks nice though. I do think it looks nice. I do like how they're going off of the kind of comic book look.
I was gonna say, I'm surprised that you wouldn't have wished that they would have done all of their artwork like the full art.
Oh no, I for sure do. I for sure do, but I know they don't.
Yeah.
Like even
I guess
although
it's to keep it consistent if you're seeing multiple cards, right?
and I think it's a way to give them some way of doing promos, right? Of like,
Yeah.
because and I think actually in that way, in that case, I would say this is me really getting into Fantasy Flight stuff. Is I know like Netrunner and Legend of the Five Rings, other LCGs I've played over the years, their promos are also full art, but usually new art or alternate art.
Yeah.
So in this case, this was kind of lazy on them that their promo is just the same art but bigger.
Yeah.
So it's like it would have been cool. It would have been more special if it was like even just different art. So like it's really obvious that it's a promo. But that has nothing to do with actually the game you would get when you buy the game. So you don't need to worry about that. That's more of my own collector part coming out. But yeah, so with that, those are our thoughts on Marvel Champions, our detailed review on the heroes, villains, components, production. And so if you saw our summary review, you know, we both gave this game a 9. And so hopefully you have a better idea of why now that we think so highly of the game. And then the thing I kind of want to end on is just letting you guys know of some of the content that's out for Marvel Champions already. Again, even just starting with the base game, you get a lot. You get 5 heroes, 3 villains. So, you know, and then all cards for all 4 aspects, obviously. So there's a lot of ways you can mix aspects with your heroes and then choose which villain to play. And I think a couple additional encounter sets, if you want to mix those in with each of the villains to make it more challenging or not. So it already has enough variety in just the base game if that's how you want to try it. In that case, you don't need to worry about like these kind of timing rules we've mentioned as some of our cons in different sections, or like the updated rules you have to look up. You could just go with what's in the base box. But just to give you an idea, I'm going to pull up the Fantasy Flight page for Marvel Champions and show you some of the content that has come out and will come out for the game. So for example, you have the base game, and then the main appeal I would say is, and as we mentioned, is the hero packs that they usually try to release it every like 2 or 3 months. That's kind of how they I guess kind of keep the excitement for this game going, right? Like there's always some new character to look out for very soon. And so early on it was Captain America, Miss Marvel being released, soon after Thor, Black Widow, Hulk, Doctor Strange, Ant-Man, Wasp. Ant-Man and Wasp were really cool because that's when they introduced what they called a 3-sided card. But it was essentially a single big card folded in half. But why it was cool is because it was fitting thematically for Ant-Man and the Wasp, because as we know from like the MCU, their power is to grow small or become giant. And so that's how they represented it on their identity cards, right? You have the typical aspect of a card where you have the alter ego side, and then the other side, you have the hero side, but you'd have like the tiny hero side. And so you could either flip to the tiny hero side or actually open up the card. So it's actually a big card and it's their giant side. And so that was a cool way of capturing that like in a physical component. Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, Gamora, Star-Lord, Drax, Venom. And then the more recent ones, yeah, Vision, War Machine, Nebula, Valkyrie. And then you have scenario packs like the villain packs, basically, Green Goblin, Wrecking Crew, which was actually, I think it was 4.
I think.
Yeah, 4 villains at the same time, which was interesting to try. It takes up a lot of space, like table space, the footprint. So just be aware of that. And it is a much older villain that obviously isn't in the MCU. So most people won't know about it, but I think it's at least mechanically cool that they went that way. Kang, which some of you might know. I don't want to spoil anything. Once and Future Kang, our friend Andy Kang, and the hood is the most recent one. And then they have accessories like play mats and sleeves. But then the other thing we kind of mentioned, but I want to provide some more details on, are the campaign expansions, or what I call the big box expansions. Because for all the LCGs, they generally all have this system of releasing these individual packs to expand their game in some way. But then every so often they kind of bookmark it with a big box expansion.
Yep.
And so in this case, these are called campaign expansions. And so you had the Rise of Red Skull, and then the Galaxy's Most Wanted, the Thanos one, and then coming up later soon is the Sinister Motives one. And so these are called campaign expansions because they try to include actually a story with the game where you kind of play through the villains included in that specific box in order, while also getting to make choices along the way of basically cards you can temporarily add to your deck depending on like how well you won against the previous villain. So it's kind of a slight campaign system, but I've tried it, I think maybe once. I don't think it adds too much. I would say if you want, you could still just obviously play one of these expansions by choosing whatever villain in it, playing the standard mode against that villain. But they also do include their own couple of heroes in each one. So that's another way to get specific heroes you might want. Like the first one, the Rise of Red Skull, had Hawkeye and Spider-Woman, Jessica Drew, where then Galaxy's Most Wanted had Rocket and Groot. A lot of people might like that. And then in the Thanos one, Mad Titan Shadow, I think is like Adam Warlock and someone. Can't remember right now. But the one that does look pretty exciting is Sinister Motives, which seems to be based off of like the Spider-Man stuff, like the Sinister Six.
Yep.
That kind of group of villains. But the heroes included in the box are Miles Morales Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy. I think they call her Spider-Ghost at that point, or maybe Spider-Gwen.
Yeah.
And so those are just other big box expansions that include their own heroes and villains that you can add to your base game. Nice. If you want any of those specific heroes or villains. And so, that is Marvel Champions, and those are our detailed thoughts on the game. Again, 9 from both of us. So hope you guys actually get to check it out. Yeah. Very highly rated by us. And so with that, we hope this was interesting, helpful. And if it was, hope you'll share this video with people you play board games with, friends and family. Hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and following us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.